Kind of a story of how the Eastern Barred Bandicoot has been recovered over the years. I'm going to talk about where we've got to now, but also some of the challenges we're facing from here on in as we're really trying to restore and rewild the landscape with a species like the Eastern Barred Bandicoot. I would also just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians, the lands we're on now, the Jara, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that to any First Nations people here today. And also to the First Nations people from where all of this work is being done, so it's across a number of different communities. Everyone here knows that we have a terrible record with extinctions amongst the mammals. I don't need to dwell on that. But one of the features of the species, these are all extinct species, just a subset of them. But you'll notice that many of them are those digging mammals. They have that ecological function. And the species that I'm talking about, the Eastern Barred Bandicoot on mainland Australia, is one of those. It's a small, 600 to 900 grams in weight. But it's a fast reproducing species. It lives hard, dies young. That's its approach. It breeds itself out of trouble, and that's worked for it for millennia until we've got these efficient predators that are an issue, and also due to habitat loss. This species is nocturnal, it's omnivorous, it pretty much eats whatever it can find, but mostly grubs, worms, those sorts of things, but it's digging for its food. That's what it does to find and feed itself. And that is what makes it this ecological engineer. Its distribution was sort of Western Victoria. It did go into South Australia. It's not quite so aligned with borders. It's not so adherent. So just apologies there. But you get the sense. It was in these sort of basalt, grassy plains and extended across that region. But the last known wild population was around Hamilton, and it was dwindling, and in 1988 a recovery team was formed, and in 1989 the animals that could be captured in the Hamilton tip, where the last ones were residing, were pulled into a captive breeding program. And it's actually from those 42 individuals that were brought in that the entire mainland Eastern Barred Bandicoot population comes from. That population eventually died out and this species was extinct in the wild. From a successful captive breeding program, though, there were hundreds, over 1,000 individuals bred in captivity over the years from 1989 onwards. There were a series of reintroduction attempts, and they're indicated on the map here. And some of those were successful, but many of them were unsuccessful. And this goes back to the points that have been made many times today, that its predation was driving those local extinctions, so the failure of these reintroduction attempts. Fox predation is a critical threat to the Eastern Barred Bandicoot, and wherever there was really a single fox getting into a population, that would wipe it out. So they're really susceptible to fox predation. So even though there were these failures, there was this adaptive management approach to understand what we can do, what are the threats and how great a threat are they. And so this was really important learning in the process. So now, towards about 2013, there were 3 sites that had successfully have Eastern Barred Bandicoots in them on this map. And obviously the key thing that this species need were areas of fox-free habitat that they could sustain themselves in. And it was the decision was made to look at some of these fox-free environments that were outside the historic range of the species. So the idea of doing assisted migration was introduced. French Island is about 170 square kilometres of fox-free environment. It's never had foxes, which is just remarkable that somewhere so close has never had foxes on it. And Phillip Island, just next to it, has had a fox eradication program successfully undertaken. So although it had foxes on it, in 2015 the last fox was detected. In 2017 it was declared that it was fox-free. So that's a whole new talk. I'm not going to go into that. But in order to go to those large fox-free islands that have people living on them and was outside its historic range, the recovery team decided to look at Churchill Island. So on this we've got Churchill Island in the foreground, in between is Phillip Island, and behind that is actually the mainland. So there are bridges crossing to each of those islands. Churchill Island is managed by the Phillip Island Nature Parks. It's it's a piece of Crown land, but it's pretty special. It's quite easy to get to with all these bridges, but it has no foxes, has no cats, it even has no rabbits on it. So it's a pretty special little patch of land, and it was decided to trial an introduction of Eastern Barred Bandicoots on this island. Even though it's only 52 hectares in size, it's got that combination of habitat types that suits the Eastern Barred Bandicoots, and is also representative of what's on Phillip Island and French Island. So it's a really nice mesocosm. It has a working farm, so it's got farmland on it, and that's the sort of habitat that the bandicoots move out into to forage. So they're a grassland species, they forage out in the open, but then they retreat during the day to these more bushland habitats where they can hide. So in 2015, it was actually the same time that the last fox was being detected on Phillip Island, but on Churchill Island, which was fox and cat free, we released 20 Eastern Barred Bandicoots there to see what they'd do and how they'd go. Now the key things for this trial were to understand, can they establish? Do they have any impact on the environment that they're going into? So this is a new environment that we haven't seen what they do in. But probably most importantly was to demonstrate to the communities on these larger islands what it's like to have a species like this in their backyard potentially. So that's what the trial was sort of about. And so we tracked them and figured out where they went, but mostly to understand whether they were surviving, and they survived really well. They started spreading across the island rapidly, so they pretty much covered the whole island in a month. So they started moving around, and we caught them on camera going for it, so they were happily starting to reproduce as well. And reproduce they did, and they did all the things that we were kind of hoping they would do. So they built in numbers quite rapidly, and within 2 years they reached a level of going from 20 to about 150, and then they plateaued off. And that's what we've seen in all the sites in these fence reserves. They get to a density and they sort of plateau off there. They're not like breeding like rabbits. They get to this point and then they sort of stay there. And that's what they've done ever since. While we were there, we're also doing some work on what do they do in this new environment. And I've talked about how they're reproductively prolific, but also, importantly, it's demonstrating some of the ecological impacts that they have. So these guys are digging about 500 digs each per night looking for food. So they're tiny little conical digs, but they're loosening the soil. They're allowing water to penetrate, matter to accumulate in there, organic matter, and just reducing that compaction. So really important jobs, and we can demonstrate that for us, but for everyone else in the community as well. And it's nice having cartoons done. We also had a look at what they're eating. They're eating all sorts of things, anything that's available, and we've discovered they quite like crabs, which is not something that we've seen before. There are crabs all around Churchill Island, so they're quite happy to chow into those. They quite like fungi, that's basically native truffles. They've got a pretty expensive diet. And there's some really important things that they're doing for the landscape. So they're also eating things like cockchafer grubs, onion weed bulbs. There's a whole lot of things that they're farmers' friends. So we can start to tell these stories about the benefits of our species. And as I said, the community engagement was a really key part of this. This is a bunch of French Island farmers coming across to see the devastation of bandicoots on Churchill. You can't tell. The bandicoots are running around, but they're just doing their little jobs. So it's really important to show them exactly what it looks like what it might look like in their backyard. Likewise with this is Phillip Island residents. It's really important, but really engaging for them to actually see what it's like having a native species that belongs there instead of rabbits and foxes and all those things. And the best group are the kids who are seeing these things, just reimagining what the landscape could be like. It's really inspiring to watch. Within 2 years, we had met the success criteria for that trial and gave us the confidence, and the regulators the confidence, to go to these larger islands, Phillip Island and French Islands. And we started off with Phillip Island, so going from Churchill Island on the map here across to the western side, which is the Sutherland Peninsula. That's actually where all the penguins are. So the penguin parade's just in that zone. And so in 2017, we actually moved 67 Eastern Barred Bandicoots from Churchill Island, as well as from Woodlands Historic Parkland and Hamilton, and introduced them into the western side of Phillip Island, and they're also pretty cute. So this was really exciting, but it's a new game here. So this is a large area of potential habitat for them. This is a 100 square kilometre island now, but it's got people everywhere, and it's also got feral cats. And it's the feral cats that have a couple of issues when it comes to Eastern Barred Bandicoots, as it turns out. So obviously predation's an issue, and cats can certainly kill Eastern Barred Bandicoots. But as we've discovered through research over many years now, since 2017, they don't seem to take very many bandicoots, so it's probably predation's not a massive risk for this particular species, Eastern Barred Bandicoots. But probably a greater risk from cats is the disease that they spread in the environment, toxoplasmosis. So what we've been seeing is we've been detecting quite a large number of, or been collecting a lot of Eastern Barred Bandicoots, and we can see that they're actually contracting the disease so rapidly that they die within 2 weeks of contracting it, and it's almost exclusive. That almost, as far as we know, they all die. So it's a very impactful disease for this particular species. Despite that, though, the population has expanded since it was introduced. So this is just an indication of what they've been up to as they've reinvaded or invaded this particular island. And there's very little of the island left that they haven't been seen in, which is excellent. The community engagement is really important, so we've got lots of information that they can get, and a lot of those data points on that map are from the public reporting sightings of bandicoots. And that's what that QR code is for. In 2019, French Island bandicoots were introduced to French Island, and on the lower map there is where they've now spread. So from that point down in that southeast corner, the bandicoots have spread since 2019. So now we've got a number of populations across Victoria. We've also set up one at Tiverton, which is the largest of the fenced reserves. It's nearly 1,000 hectares in size. And so we've got quite a substantial population now. And as a result of that, the status of this species has gone from extinct in the wild to endangered, and we've certainly massively increased the number of individuals there. So it's been a fantastic achievement. The other aspect to it is that we no longer have a captive breeding program because we just don't need it anymore. So it's pretty awesome. However, through time, the genetic diversity, it's come from a narrow gene pool. That genetic diversity's declined over time, and so that's an issue for the long-term management of this species. As a consequence of that, we manage all of these populations as a meta-population, move them around, try and maximise genetic diversity. But where we're heading now is actually genetic rescue. So there is another subspecies of Eastern Barred Bandicoot in Tasmania. So they're being introduced to broaden the genetic diversity in the mainland Eastern Barred Bandicoot, and that will go across all of the populations, giving them the adaptive potential for the future. The other critical thing that we have as a challenge into the future is how do we get Eastern Barred Bandicoots outside these safe havens, either fences or islands, and that is probably the biggest challenge that has remained. Various attempts have been made already, so the use of things like guardian dogs. That remains the largest challenge for this particular species, and it's been a common refrain throughout the presentations today. So thank you very much, and I just acknowledge all of the partners. This is not me doing this is the whole recovery team and a whole lot of funders, and it's a long-term program. And the one challenge we do still have, or another challenge we have, is now that we've changed status of the species, it's now much harder to get funding for it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Duncan. We're going to do a couple of questions, if anyone has one. Yeah, Derek?
Do you think that toxo is potentially a long-term threat, Duncan? Is there any sort of evidence to...
I think it is. There's a baseline level of threat that toxo is presenting, and if there are other challenges that the Eastern Barred Bandicoots are going to face, that's the sort of thing that might tip them over the edge and we could lose them. So cat management is going to be an essential part of the program, but we've got to manage any other potential threats that might put that additional pressure on them, and it could be the thing that tips them over. Yeah.
You just mentioned the guard dogs at the end. I was wondering if you could tell us just a little bit more about how that's working.
So there was a trial done to try and use guardian dogs to protect a mob of sheep, but in the same area that bandicoots were in. It was a trial really to understand how that program might work, what are the challenges, how do we do that well. So there was lots of learnings in that process. Of those attempts that were done, we don't have any bandicoots still in those sites. So at this stage it's not a landscape level solution, but I am open to any good suggestions of how we might do that. They were, so they had trackers, all that sort of stuff. There were definitely challenges in amongst that, but despite them effectively being there the whole time, the population still petered out.
Now, there are still populations of southern brown bandicoot in Victoria, in the wild, and I'm from Gippsland, and I know that there are also still foxes there. So, I expect you've explored why they are able to persist, whereas the Eastern Barred Bandicoots are decimated by the foxes.
Yeah, it's a really interesting issue that you raise, and that's been brought up again today as well. What's the threshold level of fox presence or abundance that is too much for a particular species? And I think southern browns, they can persist for longer, or in some presence of foxes, where Eastern Barred Bandicoots, for whatever reason, are more susceptible, and their threshold is lower again. So there's no magic number for all species. It's just for each of the ones that we're dealing with, that might be one of the ways into the future. How do we teach our species and threatened species to live in the presence of some of these predators, those threats? And that's something that, if we can crack that, then we've got another possible solution. Yeah.
We've heard today that dingoes do tend to go after foxes. Is there any thought how dingoes, as an apex, eventually you're going to need apex predators in that environment? Is there any work happening anywhere around how dingoes can replace foxes and cats as apex predators and their impact?
This is getting into territory I'm less familiar with, so I'm probably going to park that question. And particularly in an island situation, we didn't have those sorts of predators, and we have seabirds on those islands because those predators were not present. So it's a different kind of scenario that I'm most used to dealing with. There is potential in the longer term having these predator relationships, but we don't fully understand how that's going to work and whether it's going to be sufficient for recovery of something like Eastern Barred Bandicoot. Yeah.
Just really curious to know whether it is actually impossible to rid the mainland of foxes, or are there some pockets of resistance apart from the term baiting side of it? There is, I understand, still some illegal fox hunting going on. What's the policy? Or is it a mindset? Do we need to collectively say let's get rid of them?
So the questions to do with fox management more broadly, can we compute? Yeah. So Phillip Island is an example where we have successfully eradicated. It's the largest island in the world that's ever had that done. It's a really difficult thing to do. We do not have the technology to do that, or the tools at our disposal to do that at a broad landscape scale at the moment. It's not lack of willingness to try and do it. We just don't have the tools at the moment. And Bron spoke beautifully on that earlier today.